Good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be the one and only lecture video for this week, dealing with the topic of uncertainty, continuing to think about Chapter 5 in the Elliot text, and then there were several extra readings on the syllabus that I gave you um, that you'll need to answer homework questions about this week. I hope you can see how all of those extra readings are tied into the readings this week about the standards of evidence that scientists should um, uh, decide upon. How should they decide upon a standard of evidence? It can't. It's not as simple as saying that the only consideration all of the time is just being right, just being as right as possible, and that the only consideration a scientist should concern themselves with is making sure their data is as accurate as possible. That is a paramount concern of being a scientist. You want to produce accurate knowledge, but it's not the only consideration that a scientist has to make. And so, in the case of the coronavirus, we find ourselves in very, very uncertain times generally. And the question might be, as it relates to a vaccine, as it relates to trying to produce a more accurate coronavirus test that will tell somebody whether they have the virus or not. The question is, should we not abandon our scientific, values and norms of, accuracy and reliability? Shouldn't abandon them, but should we be willing to lower the standards if public health demands it? And the question we have to ask is that if we lower the standards because of public health, um, even though that might seem intuitively that there is an urgency to the situation that demands that we don't demand as high a standard of evidence because we need to get something out there as fast as possible, especially when it comes to people potentially dying. We also have to ask, what are the negative consequences of getting something out there that isn't as accurate as it could be? We end up producing something like um, false negatives when we potentially tell someone that they don't have the virus when in fact they do. And then they go out and they infect more people. And some of you mentioned this in your discussion posts. And so intuitively, it might think like times of crisis and times of emergency, especially a pandemic, which might be the very height of crisis and emergency, might suggest we lower the standards a little bit. But then we have to ask, but what other negative consequences arise? And so it becomes a kind of balance of minimizing harm and trying to maximize benefit, or just minimizing harm. Sometimes there is no good option, and so you're just minimizing harm. And so, anyways, thinking back to last week in the Heather Douglas reading, Douglas had argued that scientists have a moral responsibility, or that they can be held accountable for the claims that they make, which is to say that um, when they communicate with the public, um, we have it is reasonable to suggest that we can ask the scientist to deliberate about the consequences of their claims. What will happen as a result of the things that they say to the public or to other scientists? What will be the result? And it is totally reasonable to demand that scientists think about those consequences. That was the larger conclusion of the Heather Douglas reading. And in fact, what we were really dealing with there is uncertainty. That scientists, when they make claims to the public, when there is uncertainty involved, they are making a kind of benefit risk calculation about the potential consequences that might result. And so, in some ways, today's reading, and obviously Elliot, the author of this text, relies heavily on Heather Douglas in today's reading. He relies on her argument from the article that we read, that we can hold scientists morally responsible for the claims that they make when it comes to uncertainty. And so, in a way, today's reading is simply an extension of that, of what you read for last week. because in a sense, all we were saying was, what standard of evidence or certainties should scientists demand before making a claim, especially regarding issues of social concern? So that's really implicitly what we were talking about last week is when a scientist decides to make a claim to the public, what level of certainty or statistical significance are they going to demand for themselves before they decide to communicate? And as you can see in today's reading, when it comes to something like chemical pollutants, and so the example that's used throughout today's reading is related to the chemical dioxin. And Elliot traces a long history of the chemical dioxin in today's reading. And the question is, when it is thought that dioxin is thought to be causing an uptick in respiratory illness within a given population, if there's thought to be a connection between the two, what level of evidence should a scientist demand when the chemical, if the chemical is continuously showing up as being connected to upticks in respiratory illness, but yet there's not they can't establish the level of certainty that they would like between the two. But yet people could be contracting this virus, this disease, as a result of this chemical. More people are getting sick. And so simply trying to demand that scientists do more research, that could be your first intuition, is to say to scientists, well, if you have uncertainty, you just need to do more studies. Just do more research. And that will simply solve the problem. That will get you to the higher level of certainty. But yet, and at the same time, time is of the essence. People are getting sick. People are dying. And so suggesting that you just do more research may not be the appropriate response in these cases when public health is the concern. And so the question is, are we willing to accept a lower standard of evidence and demand a lower standard of evidence because public health is at stake? So if we're suggesting that we can lower the standard of evidence, then what Elliot is saying is that a value judgment is informing the standard of evidence that we are determining. And so this idea that science is value free, this is another way of just showing that it's obviously not. Even the decision about the standard of evidence itself in the first place is itself a value-laden judgment. You are choosing to value this over this. Maybe you're choosing to value objectivity over public health. But nonetheless, it is a value judgment. Even if you're saying you're only valuing the knowledge, it's still a kind of value judgment. You're valuing knowledge. And so Eliot's argument throughout the book is that you acknowledge your choice to choose this level of evidence over that level of evidence. And so, in your methodology section of the research you publish, and then as you communicate with the public, you say, because of X, Y, and Z, I have chosen to set my level of evidence at this. For the study I conducted, I set my level of evidence at this. And I realize a lot of you who are science majors are aware of this when you do this, when you write lab reports and things like that, or when you do experiments. So the question is, Elliot discusses avoiding either false positives or avoiding false negatives. So avoiding a false positive, saying that something is the case when it isn't, or avoiding a false saying that something isn't the case when in fact it is. The question is, which of these is more detrimental when it comes to the practice of science? And it seems like in the case of public health, at least, it seems like Elliot wants to say that, and not maybe he doesn't come right out and say this, but it seems as though we can demand a lower standard of evidence. And if we're demanding a lower standard of evidence, it might turn out to be the case that we end up with more false positives that say that somebody... Yes, sorry. It seems as though in the case of when we're trying to determine what a scientist should claim about dioxin. And if the scientist is going to claim that dioxin uh, is a contributing factor to developing this respiratory illness, it seems as though we could make an argument that the economic consequences to the chemical industry can be outstripped or outweighed by the potential lives that could be saved as a result of making these claims. Even if it turns out to be the case that we say that that this that this that this that the chemical, even if it turns out that the chemical is not as deadly as it otherwise could be. And this forces the chemical company to have to regulate themselves and to stop producing so much of this. Even if it turns out to be that the rate of disease that you contract from dioxin is not as high as we think it is, the fact that we are saving lives, even though it causes the company to have to regulate themselves a little bit, the public health demands here outweigh it, and so we are certainly more willing to risk the chance of saying that. Right. So in other words, just to be clear, we could make an argument that in the case of dioxin, a chemical pollutant that potentially is causing respiratory illness, demanding a lower standard of evidence when it comes to this particular context would seem to be justified, even if it results in some unnecessary economic burden for the company, because we are potentially saving lives in the process. And so we are going to make the claim that the chemical does cause respiratory illness. We're certain that there's a connection. It may not be that every single instance we can point to is as tight a connection as we'd like, but the benefits outweigh the costs here. And so demanding a lower standard of evidence when it comes to this, when it comes to protecting the public interest, lower standards of evidence would seem to be justified. It's much easier to demand lower standard of evidence than to say we're going to demand a higher standard of evidence, and that somehow seems as though then we're just trying to protect the company's interests. That somehow we need to be able to show, let's say, a 99% infection rate between the pollutant and the public. Then it seems as though we are valuing the economic benefits of overburdening the company rather than protecting public health. And so in that case, it seems as though we could go maybe more with the advocacy approach from the previous chapter, where the advocacy approach suggests that, indeed, it seems like the advocacy approach is the one that would be willing to go beyond the data to make a bolder claim about than what's there, because public health is at stake, rather than worrying about the economic consequences and the harms to the chemical company. Now, I got a little bit ahead of myself, and I just wanted to back up a bit, because if we're going to say that values can influence standards of evidence, we need to be clear that we do want to avoid the problem of wishful thinking. We don't want to say, so in other words, we can't have the value be the result that we're trying to get. In other words, if public health is the value, we can't simply suggest that no matter what the research says, we are going to conclude that dioxin causes respiratory illness. Similarly, if we are coming at it from the perspective of the chemical companies, we cannot simply say, because we value our economic well-being, we cannot say no matter what the research shows, we will find that there is no connection between dioxin. So we can't suffer from this kind of problem of wishful thinking, of confirmation bias, of simply wanting something to be true, and therefore, because we wish or want it to be true, it will be true. We can't do that. The role that Douglas is advocating and that Elliot is advocating for values to play a role in standards of evidence is as it applies to indirect influences. That we adjust the standard based on the value. We don't make the value itself the standard, but we're adjusting the standard based on the value. And that indirect-direct distinction is important. Now, There's more to say here. If you take a look at Eliot's text, so I have the text here. If you take a look, especially at um, page 97, Eliot gives us four different ways that values can affect the standard of evidence that scientists decide upon, right? And so, be familiar with those four different ways. That's a really helpful chart that shows, and it all revolves around this example of the dioxin. Um, the one other thing I did want to say, and Elliot brings us up towards the end. Elliot always wants, because his argument is about transparency, engagement, and representativeness. And the question is, how do these criterion of transparency, representativeness, and engagement apply to this example of uncertainty as it relates to setting standards of evidence? Well, first of all, the transparency one is you should be transparent about the fact that there are certain values that influence the standard of evidence you set, and you should be explicit about that. You should say that publicly. You should write it in your lab reports, in the research you release to the public. You should say, I decided upon this standard of evidence because X. And you should be explicit about that. That's what it means to be transparent. To engage, Elliot brings us up towards the end of the reading. He says that you should engage with other scientists, in other fields potentially. But engage with the public in trying to set the standards of evidence. And that it need not be a solitary enterprise, but that it often standards of evidence have been decided upon as a kind of community guideline themselves, and so engagement is just kind of goes along with the territory. And then the question about representativeness is an interesting one, because if it's the case that you are willing to accept a lower standard of evidence than you otherwise might because of the urgency of the issue in something like public health, it seems as though you're suggesting that because you value public health, you are suggesting that the standard of evidence should be representative of what the public would demand, and that the fact that the public here would demand a lower standard of evidence because they are the ones that stand to be harmed the most directly by the choice of the standard of evidence, then you are suggesting that your standard of evidence is representative of larger social values than merely your role as a scientist to just be correct. And so thinking about how engagement, transparency, and representativeness, the theme of Eliot's book, play into this choice about the standard of evidence is particularly true. And then this part about engagement, and this was the reason that I had you read the part at the end of the book when Elliot is talking about engagement, is that it actually shows when a different kind of engagement that Elliot calls bottom-up engagement of the AIDS activists actually resulted in the FDA being willing to lower the standard of evidence and fast-track drug trials, for example, to not have the period of waiting to determine the efficacy of certain drugs be as long, because these AIDS patients needed access to these drugs. And so the AIDS patients, in fact, if you click on the link on the syllabus, there is a video of these AIDS activists demanding and engaging in political protest, that the FDA be willing to lower its standards. And in fact, it was successful, and some of the drugs were released sooner. And according to the patients' perspectives, they were going to die anyway, so why not let them try the drug? And so there's an example of this is an example of the public themselves, of scientists, going back to my previous point, this is an example of scientists suggesting that the standard of evidence should be representative of the public. And so you see the connection there between engagement and representativeness. The engagement by the public results in a standard of evidence being representative of their needs. And so there's the connection between the two. Anyways, I hope that, again, that's all I really have in this chapter. I hope you took a look at the outside readings, because the time we're living in currently really does ask us, especially as you hear more about the development of a vaccine, you hear Dr. Fauci talking about the possibility of it being ready by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And again, that's a projection. But you hear Fauci saying things like that. and you wonder what standards of evidence, what kind of trials are being, um, what kind of protocols are being bypassed, or are they combining different steps in the vaccine development protocols than they otherwise would. I've read things that vaccines sometimes take as long as 10 to 14 years to develop, and obviously we can't be satisfied with that. And so we're living through a very real instance of asking about uncertainty as it relates to science. The role of uncertainty versus the need of the scientist to be accurate. And that's really, we really see that in our current everyday lives as we are watching this pandemic play out. So this week's readings are so extremely relevant, and that's why I hope you take a look at those extra links. That's all I have, and I will talk to you soon.